This hearing will come to order. This morning, we will consider the growing threats to U.S. national security in cyberspace. It's no exaggeration to say that we're at the dawn of a new age of warfare. Computers and the Internet have connected people around the world. However, reliance on these technologies has also made us vulnerable to cyber attacks from other countries, terrorists, and criminals. So much so that the Pentagon now counts cyberspace as the fifth domain of warfare, alongside land, air, sea, and space. Whether or not an all-out cyber war occurs, it's clear that we're in a state of ongoing cyber conflict. The White House, the State Department, and the Department of Defense have all been hacked. And of course, the Office of Personnel Management had the sensitive information of more than 21 million Americans compromised. In the private sector, hackers have crashed the computers of Sony executives, seized the personal information of more than 78 million people from the nation's second largest health insurer, and stole the credit and debit card information of more than 40 million customers of a major retailer. The magnitude of this theft is staggering, yet it is said that it takes companies an average of 205 days to even realize their system has been breached. Across the globe, Estonia found itself at the opposite end of a crippling Russia-backed denial of service attack. A computer worm shut down the Air Force and navies of France and Great Britain for a time. And an attack on North Korea, coined Dark Seoul, crippled South Korea's banking system. In the coming years, it's likely that Iran will pour more resources into cyber weapons. These have already been used against the U.S. Navy, American banks, a Las Vegas casino, and Saudi Arabia's largest oil producer, all without setting off significant retaliation. Indeed, it's been said that it is exactly the lack of international norms in responding that makes cyber weapons so attractive to Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. So we have a lot of work to do. Our top intelligence officer told Congress earlier this month that the U.S. lacks both the substance and the mindset to deterrence. Indeed, last spring, the President issued an executive order that would allow him to target individuals or organizations deemed responsible for computer attacks. But this new order, similar to the way in which terrorists and nuclear proliferators are targeted, has yet to be used. So the President's recent comment that offense is moving faster than defense is putting it mildly. From the private sector to government, our country is taking body blow after body blow in cyberspace. Why aren't we hitting back? As one observer notes, we have a deterrence deficit. The new agreement between the United States and China on economic espionage would be a step forward if China actually abides by it. And others like Iran and Russia will be watching closely how the United States responds to what is perhaps the greatest theft in history. We look forward to hearing from our witnesses what is cyber war and how does it differ from cyber conflict and cyber espionage. Could better attribution techniques be developed to help the United States deter cyber attacks? What is the role of diplomacy in containing cyber conflict? Do the international norms surrounding traditional warfare apply? And what are the foreign policy implications of continued cyber infiltrations and espionage? We look forward to our witnesses' testimony as we consider U.S. responses to one of the most urgent problems facing the United States. And I now turn to the ranking member for any opening comments he might have.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Salmon. And to our witnesses, welcome to the Foreign Affairs Committee. We badly need your expertise because our focus today is a new frontier when it comes to enhancing American security, and I agree with everything that my colleague just said. For years, cyber attacks from overseas have posed a growing threat to the United States. Cyber crimes such as the breach of the credit card systems at Target stores by Russian hackers in 2013 have put millions of American consumers at risk. Cyber espionage by foreign governments, the recent attack on the Office of Personnel Management, for example, threatens to expose national security information and violates the privacy of many, many American citizens. Today, this committee is focusing on cyber war. That's a relatively new term, and we still don't have a consensus about what it exactly means. Generally speaking, cyber war is understood as something different from the attacks that the United States has already experienced. So today I hope we can provide a little clarity on what we mean by cyber war. When does an act of espionage or vandalism cross the line and become an act of war? What would it take for a cyber attack to violate prohibitions against the use of force under the laws of armed conflict? And regardless of the terminology we use, what should we be doing to protect the security of the United States and our citizens? I think it's urgent that we move quickly to address this challenge because it's unlike any threat we've seen in the past. In recent history, the power of our military and safety of our shores have kept the violence of conventional warfare at a distance from most Americans. But technology has made the world smaller and more interconnected, for better and for worse. A conventional war today could easily be accomplished by cyber attacks on critical infrastructure here at home. Our power grid, air traffic control systems, water treatment facilities, or freight infrastructure could all be targeted. Our private sector is also a likely target. The governments of China, Russia, Iran, and other nations understand the value of American business secrets and intellectual property. That's why the Justice Department indicted 5 members of the Chinese military for conspiring to steal American trade secrets from the metal and energy sectors and pass them along to Chinese businesses. I hope our witnesses can provide some insight about the best ways to shore up our defenses against these threats. And as we guard against this danger at home, I think America has a role to play around the world, helping to establish standards for cyber activity, bringing governments together to prevent and put a stop to cyber conflict. We led the way when it came to conventional conflict. We can lead the way again. In fact, we've already taken positive steps. In 2011, the Obama administration released an international strategy for cyberspace, calling for stronger diplomacy and private-public partnership to deal with this issue. A year later, we pushed to classify cyber activities causing death, injury, or significant destruction as a use of force under international law. We work with Russia and China through the UN to limit the threat of cyber attacks against critical infrastructure. And we took another big step last week. Before Chinese President Xi visited the United States, several members of this committee wrote to President Obama, singling out the Chinese government's cyber theft of intellectual property as a major concern. So I was very pleased that on Friday, the administration announced a huge win for U.S. companies. President Obama secured a commitment from the Chinese government to stop engaging in state-sponsored cyber theft of intellectual property, including trade secrets and confidential business information. What's more, the Chinese agreed to work with us to prosecute cyber criminals targeting American assets. This is a significant achievement, but, of course, we need to make sure that China holds up its end of the deal. Talk is cheap. We have to make sure that they produce, and we have to produce by being tough. Mr. Chairman, let me just add, even though it's off topic, last week, in my opinion, we achieved another landmark in U.S.-China cooperation on another critical threat, climate change. After years of pressure from the U.S. at very high levels, the Chinese will start a cap-and-trade system to curb carbon emissions in their country. I believe it's a very important step. Let me close by saying that while we've taken steps at home and shown leadership around the world, we still have a long way to go just to understand the nature and threat of cyber war, let alone what's necessary to contain this threat and protect our interests. So again, let me thank our witnesses. I look forward to a good discussion and look forward to hearing their expertise. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. This morning, we're pleased to be joined by a distinguished panel. First, Dr. James Lewis is a senior fellow and director in the Strategic Technologies Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Before joining CSIS, Dr. Lewis served in both the Department of State and the Department of Commerce. Welcome. Dr. Catherine Lotriante, is that correct? Is the director of the Institute for Law, Science, and Global Security at Georgetown University, where she teaches courses on national security law, U.S. intelligence law, and international law. Welcome. Mr. Bob Butler is an adjunct senior fellow in the Technology and National Security Program and the Center for New American Security. Mr. Butler has led a long career in information technology, intelligence, and national security in both the private and public sector. And he's going to the best state in the country this afternoon, Arizona. So happy to have that. Without objection, the witnesses' full prepared statements will be made part of the record, and members will have 5 calendar days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record. Dr. Lewis, would you please summarize your remarks?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the committee for inviting me to testify. Cybersecurity is a foreign policy problem, so it falls squarely in the jurisdiction of this committee. While much of our discussion focuses on domestic solutions, these by themselves are inadequate to secure our networks against foreign opponents. 5 countries have advanced cyber attack capabilities: the US, the UK, Russia, China, and Israel. And several other countries are developing these capabilities. They include Iran and North Korea, both of which who have used cyber attacks against American companies. So far, when we look at these countries, they use their cyber attack capabilities in a manner that's consistent with their national military strategies and their policies. This means that cyber war is unlikely outside of some larger conflict. If that conflict were to occur, however, whether it was over the South China Sea or over the Russian interventions around the world, our opponents would use cyber attack to disrupt command and control systems and the software that controls advanced weapons. Both Russia and China have probed the most advanced U.S. weapon systems to prepare for this. Critical infrastructure is a second-order target. Countries will attack it when they think they control the risk of escalation or when they are desperate. But it is vulnerable, and it is a target that both Russia and China have probed. While there is agreement that international law, including the laws of armed conflict, apply to cyber war, there remains areas of significant dispute, particularly over what qualifies as an armed attack or a use of force in cyberspace. There is a gray area, since a cyber attack can cause disruption without causing destruction or casualties. We have seen this with Iran's attack on Saudi Aramco and North Korea's action against Sony. How the laws of armed conflict apply to this gray area is unclear. The concepts of use and force in armed attack underpin our treaty obligations for mutual defense. The U.S. has worked with its allies in NATO and in Asia to modify our existing treaties to ensure that the use of force in cyberspace is covered by them as part of mutual defense. The definition of armed attack and use of force also determine deterrence thresholds. And I noted that I think the chairman talked about a deterrence deficit. We clearly have that. It's a major problem. In response to Sony and to Iran's actions against the Sands Casino, the administration took steps to strengthen deterrence, including public discussion of our improved attribution capabilities and the creation of new cybersecurity sanctions. The goal was to create a credible threat. It's too early to tell if this has worked, but traditional military espionage does not work and will not work against cybercrime or cyber espionage. The U.S. needs to find something other than military threats to stop these activities. Indictments and sanctions can threaten deterrence, but more work is needed, and this is where the committee can play an important role. It could consider, among other things, expanded oversight of diplomatic activities, including the implementation and compliance with alliance commitments and bilateral agreements, such as the recent agreement with China, and the work in the UN to build norms on responsible state behavior. It could look at legislative actions to strengthen countermeasures. We won't always go to war over cyber espionage. In fact, we're unlikely to ever go to war over cyber espionage. But there are countermeasures, such as sanctions or other penalties, that we know have an effect on our opponents. It would be useful to provide greater clarity into the legal basis for the authorization of the use of force in cyberspace. Finally, you mentioned the existing 2011 international strategy. This needs to be revised. It was written for a much different security environment, and it needs a second look, something that either this administration or the next will have to do. Cybersecurity poses a difficult challenge for foreign policy. Congress can help by providing oversight and guidance on its international and diplomatic aspects. I thank the committee for the opportunity to testify and will be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Lotriante.
Thank you for the invitation to speak to you today about international law and cyber operations. Even though there has not yet been discrete cyber operations that rise to the level of damage to property and lives equivalent to kinetic attacks, cyber operations are a part of the traditional military operations today, fast becoming a part of modern kinetic warfare. Such cyber operations first appeared overtly in the 2008 armed conflict between Georgia and Russia, also during the armed conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq, and throughout the armed conflict in Libya and Syria, and recently have played a significant role during the 2014 armed conflict between Russia and Ukraine. This emerging reality requires that states examine the question of how to treat cyber operations under international law. There appears no alternative at present but to consider a host of legal propositions in examining the law related to cyber operations and assessing whether the laws that we currently have are adequate as cyber operations become ubiquitous. Under current international law, cyber operations would amount to internationally wrongful acts if they were inconsistent with established international law. To date, there is only one treaty that explicitly addresses cyber activities. That's the 2001 Budapest Convention on Cybercrime. There is a growing international consensus that aspects of international law do apply in the cyber domain, but most of the details about how it applies remains in flux. Many states have affirmed the application of existing laws, including the UN Charter and the laws of armed conflict. And while it is well settled in the U.S. that the UN Charter and the laws of armed conflict apply to cyber warfare, the challenge is determining exactly how it applies and getting international agreement on those issues. In July of this year, the fourth UN Group of Government Experts, under the auspices of the Secretary General and composed of 20 states, finalized its recent report to the General Assembly. The report highlighted norms for peacetime that states should abide by, including states should not conduct or knowingly support actions that intentionally damage critical infrastructure of other states. Under the international law related to the use of force, it remains unclear whether a cyber operation that does not result in physical damage or injury can nevertheless amount to an armed attack for purposes of Article 51 of the UN Charter, when it generates severe but non-destructive or injurious effects. While the U.S. has asserted in a report to the UN that under, quote, under some circumstances a disruptive activity in cyberspace could constitute an armed attack, close quote, it has not indicated which sorts of disruptive activities would qualify. And under international humanitarian law, or IHL, cyber operations executed in the context of an armed conflict are subject to the law of armed conflict. For example, because the conflict between Russia and the Ukraine is international in nature, the ensuing cyber operations are subject to IHL. However, for the customary legal rules of proportionality and the requirement to take certain precautions during an attack under IHL, the meaning of the word attack for purposes of cyber operations is contested, and yet it's critically important in determining if the rules apply. In conclusion, while there may never be a comprehensive treaty on cyber operations under international law, verbal acts such as diplomatic statements, policy statements, press releases, military manuals, decisions of national courts, opinions of official legal advisors, pleadings before international tribunals, and executive decisions and regulations, and importantly for this committee, domestic legislation can also serve to develop customary international law. The U.S. can actively work to develop these specific customary principles that it wishes to prevail internationally by being outspoken and transparent about what it views as the law in cyberspace. This, of course, will also require constant and consistent action along with those words. Given the existing difficulties involved with adopting a new treaty in this area, a reinterpretation of existing laws to accord with the emergence of cyber operations, along with the development of new customs that serve to adapt existing norms to cyber operations, will likely be the path states take. The U.S. can build deterrence by telegraphing or clearly articulating and promulgating an interpretation of the law it believes is applicable to cyber operations. Doing this means being specific and being clear, specifically about the thresholds for a use of force and an armed attack under the law. For example, on the issue of what constitutes a use of force, the U.S. could take the position that cyber operations executed against certain categories of targets, whether they are SCADA systems or specific critical infrastructures, creates a rebuttable presumption that such actions constitute a use of force for purposes of Article 2 of the UN Charter. The U.S. could explicitly state such a position in a White House national security strategy, for instance. In making such legal assertions regarding thresholds and acting in accordance with those outlined thresholds, the U.S. could also seek agreement on these explicit thresholds from other states to develop clearly what the law is. Under such a legal framework, we can develop methods of countermeasures to hold those accountable for not complying with the law. This is just one way to develop deterrence when speaking about cyber conflict. I thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Butler.
Congressman Salmon, Ranking Member Engel, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you again for the invitation to come and talk about cyber war and related topics. These are my opinions and not necessarily those of the U.S. government or the Center for New American Security. The bottom line up front for me is that we've done a good job, I think, as a country in building strategy and developing strategy. We are lagging in implementation, and I would agree with my colleagues and Congressman Salmon's remarks about deterrence deficit. We are definitely in a situation of a deterrence deficit, and we are increasing our risk exposure over time by not remedying those actions. I say this from my perspective as a software developer. That's how I was trained. And from a DoD perspective, where I served in the United States Air Force for 26 years, both as a computer systems officer and an intelligence officer. From a policy perspective, having served as a Deputy Assistant Secretary over at the Pentagon on cyber policy, and from 6 years in the private sector, working in both building business and building security programs globally. So rather than going through my remarks, I'd just like to summarize some of the salient points and then stand ready for your questions. First of all, on the topic of cyber war, I think that's a misnomer. We are talking more about actions and tools and capabilities in cyberspace that are used as we move through cyber conflict. And so the idea within the Department of Defense of a combined arms campaign, where cyber capabilities are integrated as we go through different phases on the run-up to conflict and de-escalation. With regards to the treaties, I think Catherine went through it in quite a good detail. My sense, and from practical experience, is that the law of armed conflict does apply in cyberspace, as well as other international rule sets. There are principles such as proportionality that do apply. Treaties are important. What we have with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in terms of collective defense is an important aspect of it. And those kinds of treaties that fall below the level of war that we're using in law enforcement, like the Budapest Convention that Dr. Locinati mentioned, I think are key aspects of how we need to think through this problem set. With regards to deterrence, we've mentioned the international strategy on cyberspace a few times. That really is our declaratory statement. We reserve the right to use all means to defend ourselves in accordance with international law. But saying something is not just the only element of deterrence. We need to be able to display and project force, whether that be in economic sanctions or in other ways. We need to have deterrence by denial, where we build up defenses and avoid things like an OPM breach. We need to look at resiliency that takes us beyond U.S. government activity and into the critical infrastructure. And we need to do more in those areas. From the standpoint of diplomacy, I think there is definitely a role in this emerging area of cyber diplomacy, whether it be bilateral, multilateral relationships, as we see with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or multi-stakeholder kinds of partnerships, as we talked about with the United Nations and the Government Group of Experts, or in private sector collaboration. And more on that in just a few moments. In terms of foreign policy implications, certainly I think there are foreign policy thrusts here. We need to develop norms. We need to also develop standards and comport to international standards and ensure others comport to those international standards as well. We need to have a level set of rules. We need to build partnerships, public-private partnerships that extend internationally, and we need to find enforcement mechanisms as we go forward in time. In terms of the administration and the assessment that I would have is, again, strategy blueprints have been good, but our implementation has been lagging. We need, from the President on down, a unified vision and a much greater focus on implementation. Here we need to look at resources, yes, but authorities and, more importantly, accountability within each of the departments that have responsibilities here. And I do believe this takes us into new ways of looking at how cyber activities should be comported over time. In terms of the laws, we need to update the laws, whether it be the existing communications laws, the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, or the Critical Infrastructure Partnership Advisory Council authorities. Those all need to be used as tools, updated tools, to help us in this area of building deterrence. Finally, in terms of the role for the committee, I really endorse Jim Lewis's comment about the committee taking on a greater role in reviewing the international strategy on cyberspace. It does need to be updated. The threat has changed significantly. We need measures of effectiveness, and I think it would be helpful for the committee to be involved there. Secondly, I think as an aspect of that, a key aspect is to begin to drive international private-public partnerships, to build trust as well as to build a coalition of interested stakeholders to help us with norm development, enforcement of those norms, and understanding of cyber conflict. I think to get to that particular point, it's important to bring in U.S.-based multinational representatives and experts to help with that discussion and look at things that have been discussed already from the government side, like the Wassenaar agreements on export control. And then finally, I think from an education standpoint, ways that we can actually increase the understanding through tabletop exercises, and I would commend that, that the committee think about using such types of tabletop exercises to continue their education and promotion of where they want to go in helping us with cyberspace. I stand ready to address your questions.
Thank you. We'll now begin panel or member questions. Last week, President Xi Jinping visited the United States. Among other things, they came to an agreement on economic espionage, cyber espionage, that neither country's government will conduct or knowingly support cyber-enabled theft or intellectual property, of intellectual property, with the intent of providing competitive advantages to companies or commercial sectors. To me, the wording is vague, and it gives both the U.S. and the Chinese sides substantial room for interpretation. Tell me, Dr. Lewis, does this agreement actually mean anything? Why do you believe President Obama chose to forego any public discussion of the grievous economic and security losses from China's previous attacks? And given that China believes that economic security is a national security imperative, do you predict whether China will actually substantially decrease or cease cyber theft in this realm?
Well, I would agree with you. Thank you for the question. By the way, the very first time I ever testified 15 years ago was in front of this committee. I couldn't sleep the night before. I sweat through my shirt and I stuttered. So it's a lot more fun being here as a private citizen.
Dr. Lewis, I have the same problem.
Yeah.
Just stay awake for the answers and we'll be all right.
That's my advice. It is a significant step forward because for the first time, a Chinese leader has addressed the issue of commercial espionage. And in the past, the Chinese have stoutly denied in public that they have any concern with this activity. In private, they have made the argument that for them, commercial espionage is a national security issue, and so therefore they are legitimate in that kind of espionage. In talking to administration officials, they know there's wiggle room in the language. They have told me they will be watching it closely to see how well the Chinese live up to their commitments. It's not an on-off switch. This is very difficult for Xi, in particular because the PLA, which is our primary actor, makes money. This is a source of extracurricular income for them, and they're not going to be happy giving it up. But we can now count to a degree the number of economic espionage incidents that occur in the U.S. FBI and NSA can count them. And so that means if the Chinese live up to their agreement, the number should start to go down. If it stays the same or goes up, we know they're not. And what I was told by, again, administration officials is sanctions are still on the table. They realize they may have to take action.
Mr. Butler, despite affirmations and reassurances, we should still be prepared for malicious cyber incidents, correct? With your prior military and government service and current private sector experience, what do you think our priorities should be in contingency planning for these attacks or for continued cyber espionage that targets our military and economic assets? And lastly, for anyone in the panel, after you address that question, if this government, or excuse me, if this agreement doesn't live up to its word, what should the U.S. government do besides maybe sanctions? Are there other opportunities to escalate the severity of the issue? So what are some of the other options? Mr. Butler.
Thank you, Congressman Salmon. I think our priority is to get our own house in order here. We need to improve our defenses first and foremost. We can't go through another type of breach like we've seen at the magnitude and severity of the OPM breach. So finding ways to, what I would say, create cyber hygiene and doing that quickly will help us in a significant way. I think beyond that, it's now thinking through resiliency within the critical infrastructure. So as a foundational piece, I think we need to continue to improve in our deterrence by denial activities. At the same time, we need to think through how to establish norms much faster and find ways to enforce those norms. Again, I think one aspect of that is what I was discussing earlier by bringing the private sector into the discussion to help us with understanding their perspective and looking at ways that we can tie together continuity of government and continuity of business type activity. Beyond that, in terms of other options, we need to make sure that we not only speak about the potential for creating cost on the part of an adversary, but being able to show that. And that needs to be certainly in the demonstration of force, things like economic sanctions, but it's also showing the ability to be able to operate in spite of attacks. And so finding ways to work across the spectrum of those options, I think, is absolutely critical. It is truly, when we talk about deterrence today, it is cross-domain. It is the idea of using the economic sanctions, potentially some other tools in the economic inventory that take us from beyond the OFAC work into looking at ways that we could restrict travel of individuals into our country based on wrongful acts that are being prosecuted. It is certainly building the capability through our law enforcement activities and finding ways to not only name and shame, but to continue to work with entities like Interpol to help us with taking down illegal activity around the world. It is working to continue to grow the cyber mission forces that we've laid out in the defense cyber strategy. So I think it's a multifaceted strategy. It's cross-domain deterrence.
If I can add something to that, I think that with this agreement, it would be very good if the United States had a plan in place already for, one, how they're going to verify this. So optimally, right now, we would have measures in place and sensors in place that we'd be able to basically approach the Chinese, and we'd have to determine now which forum we'd want to approach them in, when and if they cheat in this agreement. Once that happens, though, I think we have to have, as Bob said, a cross-domain strategy, and I would activate all those elements at once, meaning I would use law enforcement tools. I would start prosecuting those that are violating our domestic law. I'd pull out all the options on sanctions, whether it's financial or others. I would also look at the WTO, and I would start bringing immediately. I would have the USTR ready to bring charges or claims against China for violations in the TRIPS agreement. And of course, less spoken of publicly, I would have our intelligence organizations actively prepared to do counterintelligence and, in the more covert world, things to counter their actions. So I think we need to have that plan now and assume the worst, assume that they will cheat, so the minute they do, we have every avenue of the U.S. government prepared to take action.
And just to build on that quickly, there was a intense debate within the administration on how to respond to the OPM hack, and sanctions were the middle course. Some people wanted to do more aggressive things. Some people didn't want to do anything. So I think that the Chinese got the message that we were mad about this and would take action. And in the future, to both strengthen deterrence and to make sure there's compliance with the agreement, we probably will need to think about possible punitive actions, whether that's publishing financial data, leaking financial data on Chinese leaders, or erasing data on their servers, sanctions, indictments. There's a range of tools, but we'll probably have to use them.
We're going to go now to our ranking member, Mr. Elliot Engel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As your testimony shows, the international community has not yet formed a consensus on how to reduce cyber conflict. For example, some of our adversaries in cyberspace have advocated for an arms control approach, while America is focused on establishing global norms and confidence-building measures. So let me ask Dr. Lewis and Mr. Butler, what do you see as the greatest factors motivating countries to support one approach over the other, and what are the most significant barriers to fostering a greater international consensus? Why don't we start with you, Dr. Lewis?
Thank you for the question. One of the things that's interesting is that while there's a wide disparity of views on what we should do, all countries are afraid of cyber war, and this is from the biggest to the smallest. And many of them fear Cyber Command quite a bit. And I always wonder, should I tell them the truth, or should I let them continue to believe that we're omnipotent? But that's the impression, and so it's that shared fear that drives the negotiation. The dilemmas with a traditional arms control approach, which is the preferred Russian approach, is it's difficult to define what is a cyber arm. They clearly would like to include information in that category. The Russians talk about information weapons, which doesn't make any sense, right? But they would like to control information, and they have supporters in the world. So the treaty approach has verification problems, it has definition problems, and that's why the US decided to go after norms of state behavior. You have to think about how you would verify compliance with norms, and you have to think about penalties if norms aren't followed. But the arms control approach has just not been that useful because of its sort of structural problems that we face. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Butler?
Yes, Congressman Engel. I think the incentives and the factors for driving people into this discussion, really, everyone is affected by some type of malware or maliciousness that's going on in cyberspace, whether it's China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, or allies are affected. And so there is an incentive to come to the table and discuss. The challenge, as Jim indicated, is there is fear. There's problems with taxonomy. We have different doctrines in terms of what's in cyberspace, what's not in cyberspace, these physical, logical structures. We are also challenged with regards to understanding our overall objectives as we come to the table. As we look at, for instance, the United States, we're trying to create an open and secure environment that allows for a global transaction platform and national security. Many countries don't see the benefits in that, but they see it as a U.S.-defined environment. And so going to multi-stakeholder types of venues actually helps us, the government group of experts, for instance. And then finally, I would say that one of the other barriers is getting folks involved in the global economic system. And here's where the private sector, again, comes into play. I think it's important for nations, whether they're very, very developed or underdeveloped, to see where we're heading and helping folks to begin to see the value of being on the internet. There is this aspect of fear that not only comes from cyber war for high-end states, but as we think about some of the underdeveloped countries of the world, not understanding exactly where we're going in terms of an interconnected society.
Thank you. Dr. Lotriante, let me throw a double-edged question at you. As international conflict increasingly moves into cyberspace, we need to be prepared for situations in which our military engages in hostilities overseas without deploying troops outside the United States. So in your opinion, would such activities trigger the congressional oversight and authorization requirements of the War Powers Resolution? And what steps should Congress take to ensure that cyber activities of the U.S. military fall within these oversight and authorization requirements? And let me also add that as the United States works to develop global norms and customary international law governing cyber conflict, what legal clarifications are needed to ensure that we are able to prevent and respond to cyber threats by terrorist groups and other non-state actors?
Okay, thank you for the two-part question. First, on your question with respect to the applicability of the War Powers Resolution. So as it is today, the language of that statute today, for most of the cyber activities that one could anticipate or think of, where the U.S. would be conducting these activities abroad without soldiers engaged abroad, my position on that and the current state of the language is it is not applicable, meaning that if you look at the words within that statute, there could be a whole scope of cyber activities that would not trigger. So if the president is honestly looking at that statute and trying to fulfill his reporting and consulting requirements, there are a lot of activities that would not be triggered. There are two elements of that resolution that bring me to that reason. The two triggering elements for reporting is the words armed forces and hostilities. And when you're talking about not just cyber, but other emerging technologies, even drones, nanotechnology, there's a slew of new technologies in which this resolution is wholly inadequate in terms of covering. But particularly with cyber, when you're talking about armed forces, that language needs to be expanded if you would like to cover and trigger that consulting and reporting requirement from the executive branch, as well as the phraseology with respect to hostilities. That has to also be expanded. So, for instance, on the armed forces, it's not so much armed forces will be involved overseas necessarily when you're talking about the use of cyber tools by the president, but you need to use the language that would be suitable for that statute would be something to the effect of adding capabilities, language about capabilities, or even provisions or supplies. And as far as the phrase in the statute on hostilities, I would expand that language and not just leave it as it is today, but expand it to include it's not only engaging in hostilities, but it's also potentially the violation of a sovereignty of another nation that may trigger it. Now, this of course would take some consultation, but if you ask me the original intent of that statute, if we wanted that original intent to consist today, and you want the reporting and consulting that was envisioned for the legislative branch in the war-making process with the president, that's what I would say would need to be changed. That was the first one. Would you like me to go on to the second question you had? Or
Should we do that in writing? Maybe we just answer
I guess we can do that in writing.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Let me ask a quick question to Dr. Lewis. We had the cyber attack on Turkey's electric grid that was on March 31st of 2015. That was a 12-hour power outage, affected 40 million people in Turkey. You had the Iran cyber attack against American companies and the 2012 cyber attack on Saudi Arabia's oil conglomerate. That destroyed the data on tens of thousands of computers. So the question I have is, what impact could the administration's lifting of sanctions on Iran have on Iran's cyber capabilities going forward?
It's a very good question, and one that I think people, particularly in the financial sector, have been paying close attention to. The theory that most folks had was that Iran would be on its best behavior while the nuclear deal was being negotiated.
But they were hacking during they were doing the attacks during the deal.
Well, they weren't doing as much as they were doing against U.S. banks. They toned back a little bit, and the question is, once this is completed, will they resume their activity? And so I think that's something that we're all watching. My assumption is that Iran will be aggressive in the Persian Gulf, and the whole point of much of the discussion around the Sony episode.
Okay, I've got to stop you right there, because James Clapper says that Iran used cyber to attack U.S. military networks in December 2014. That would be in the middle of the Iranian nuclear negotiations. I don't know how you can present this thesis if they're in bad behavior in the middle of a negotiation where they're trying to get us to do what they want us to do, and now you say, well, now afterwards, after we've lost the leverage, they're going to change their behavior. And let me go to another question.
Change their behavior for the worse.
Yeah.
They are, one of the changes in the last few years has been significant improvement on Iran's attack capabilities.
Yeah.
So the concern is, will they use them against the U.S.? And they use them against SANS,
Yeah,
so.
yeah. Well, very good. I appreciate that, Dr. Lewis. I've got a question for Bob Butler. The DNI, our Director of National Intelligence, says he doesn't think that the agreement announced last week during the visit of President Xi is going to impact the bottom line in how China attempts to access U.S. computer systems, including our intellectual property. I was going to see if you agree with that. How do you gauge that agreement? Is it going to affect the cyber conflict? Are they going to honor the agreement?
I think the proof's in the pudding. We're going to have to wait and see. I mean, we had an agreement on Friday. We've also had an informal announcement about the Chinese not being very happy with some of our positions on U.S. Internet policy since then. I think we need to see from a validation and verification standpoint with regards to the follow-through on this. My sense is the wording is important. There was no agreement, of course, on espionage writ large, specifically on commercial secrets and how that is interpreted. So I think we need to put in place immediately some type of validation and verification scheme that takes advantage of, yes, our national intelligence apparatus, but also capabilities that we have in the private sector to understand what exactly is changing and how it's changing as we go forward in time.
Let me ask a question of Dr. Lotiantre. Which U.S. government agencies are responsible for addressing cyber war-related threats and response and recovery efforts? Because the point I want to make is, should the Department of Defense protect the cybersecurity of the U.S. homeland from significant cyber attacks? And is it really time for us to look at this just as, during the Second World War, we stood up the Air Force as a separate branch in order to give that responsibility, give that authority? Is it time to do something like that?
So I think there are multiple agencies and departments that have underneath their legal mission or authority a role to play, both in preventing, but also countering and responding. First, I would start with State Department, the significant role in the diplomacy. In order to have a form of deterrence, we need to have the establishment of some agreements, these norms, right, to make a link.
You know what I'm going to ask you to do, as an attorney, you've got a great background in this. Could you delineate that in writing for me? Because I'm about to be out of time, and I wanted to ask Bob Butler one more question. If a cyber attack took down our financial system or took down the electrical grid, would the United States consider it a use of force? And if so, how would we determine who to strike back and who to strike against? And Dr. Lotiantre, I'm going to ask you that too, but Bob?
Sure. Mr. Chairman, certainly from the vantage point of taking down life safety systems, the grid, water treatment systems, and looking at our financial services, I think that would be of serious consequence. We are planning, from a DoD standpoint, national teams to support that. In terms of figuring it out, I think we have to understand what the roll-up is to cyber conflict. And maybe just take 30 seconds here to explain how that takes place. I mean, initially, we see reconnaissance activity, right? We see people scanning networks. We then see people crawling on networks. Then we see focused targeting of activity based on our knowledge, based on adversaries' knowledge from what they've done on reconnaissance and surveillance activities. Then potentially we see exploitation through malware that either could lead to stealing things. It could also be an implant that basically positions someone for a further attack, whether it's disruptive or destructive. We would need to find and lay in intelligence, both on the national security side and with commercial sensors, to help us understand what's going on.
Well, okay, so here's what I'm going to say. I'm out of time, but yep. If any of the three witnesses for the last two questions have some ideas here in terms of attribution techniques and how we could follow up on that, because that's what you're getting to, that would be helpful to the committee. We now go to Karen Bass of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In listening to your testimony, I wanted to know if either one of you, out of the three, could give me examples of where you think other countries are doing a good job in terms of cybersecurity. And maybe there's some lessons that we can learn from there. And then I believe it was you, Mr. Butler, that were talking about the consequences and maybe imposing sanctions on individuals. But then how do we address it when a lot of this is state-run? And then finally, sorry to load up all my questions, but when I think of some of the major terrorist groups that we're dealing with, whether it's Al-Qaeda or ISIS or the Taliban, what level of involvement do they have in cyber attacks?
I'll start. Let me come back briefly to the earlier question, though, which is if you want to get the Iranians to change how they think about this, you don't want to take a passive approach, and that's been one of our problems. One of our problems in cybersecurity. We need to make credible threats, and we need to have countries believe that we will respond with some punitive action. Not a lot of people are doing a good job on this. The Israelis have done a good job, but not perfect. The Russians have done a good job, the French, and to some extent the British. That might be it in the world. We do okay, but one of the things we need to do is make people believe that if they hack us, there will be punishment. And that's maybe the most important thing we can do.
And are any of our intelligence agencies cooperating or are taking lessons and implementing practices from the countries you just mentioned?
We have really close relations with the British. We have okay relations with the Israelis and the French. Good relations, but not as close as the British. So there's an effort in the context of our alliances to build a collective defense.
Thank you.
Let me go to your first question with regards to states that are doing good work in the area of cybersecurity. I think the U.S. model and allied models continue to grow. And when I look at really good work going on around the globe, I think of the partnerships that we've got in place. So if I look at the Japanese Computer Emergency Response Team, which is really the APAC Computer Emergency Response Team, they've taken lessons learned from what we've done and others, and are really doing a pretty good job in tracking advanced persistent threats. When I think about, for instance, what are we doing on the Global Transaction Platform, the Financial Services ISAC, Information Sharing and Analysis Center, has broadened their approach where they're now looking globally as opposed to just within the country. There's a new activity that stood up in Singapore that is an extension of Interpol, the Global Complex, Global Center for Innovation. Here, a model that we, I think, pioneered, maybe some others were involved in terms of botnet takedowns, proactive botnet takedowns, is being worked on a global basis. So I think both on the proactive prevention side as well as on the prevent or on the response side, there are models that we can look at. And again, we have been involved with helping in that area, but we can also learn from that as well. In terms of the sanction enforcements, I think, again, it's a combination of trust and verify. So there's different economic and trade remedies that could be employed. We need to look at the impact, as best we know it, would have on the nation state. And then we need to think through the enforcement, the verification mechanism. And certainly intelligence is involved in there. But it could also be, we could also ensure validation through a partner working in conjunction with us against that potential adversary. And then in terms of looking at the terrorist issue, deterrence is different. I like to talk about tailored deterrence, right, against nation states, a nation state, and what is required to deter that particular actor. A lot of the things we've been talking about lately really are focused on determined resource nation states as opposed to terrorist groups. And in this space, we need to think hard about, for instance, an ISIS that is growing in social media campaigns and recruiting and creating challenges for us. How do we deter those kinds of actors? And how do we deter actors that are really where we don't know a lot about their doctrine? I mean,
Thank you. Appreciate it. Dr. Latrante?
In terms of other countries working well on the cybersecurity front, I would put in a word for the Brits in terms of what I've seen they do, not mainly a lot in the awareness area and also working with their universities. They have less than we do in this country, but they have done a lot of good work, the government has, in reaching out and coordinating to understand what resources on the higher education level and putting in R&D as well. They also, I think they're not better than us, but they've followed our lead in most of the ways that we've communicated with the private sector. I think they also are working on getting better at that, sending out warnings to their companies about the nature of the threat. But I would say in general, and this is not always the case, I think the U.S. is the lead in this. And the Europeans, I've heard the Europeans say that, and I've often had, whether it's the Japanese or the Germans or other East Asian countries, when they come into town, the officials are coming into town and going to State Department, they often come to me and they've asked me, to me about how the U.S. is handling and doing their cybersecurity work, and they're looking to us for good examples, for models. So I think that might be my general sense. On the sanctions, over the years, watching how under international law, targeted sanctions, while slow in terms of their effectiveness, can ultimately be effective. I think you can do very targeted, smart sanctions against individuals. I personally like the thought of freezing assets. When people lose their money and they no longer can get their money, you usually see some effect.
Thank you.
And terrorist groups are also definitely, as Bob has already said, a consideration we have to deal with.
Thank you very much.
We go now to Mr. Dana Rohrabacher of California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I guess we're talking about a number of approaches to this sort of new subject. It's I don't think anybody talked about this 20 years ago, and when we just said when we're talking about a retaliation, I was thinking in terms of retaliation versus sanctions. Would it not be better to try to set up a system where we're not offering some sort of economic sanction, but instead if we catch you and your people, how do you say, disturbing our system or our economic system in some way, or our weapon systems, that we will just retaliate against your systems? That Chinese banks will have to experience some problems if people keep hacking into our banks? Isn't that what, wouldn't that be more effective than telling the Chinese government you're going to not be able to deliver any more widgets over here that you've manufactured?
And,
I'll ask the whole panel that. Go right ahead.
I can say something about the law, at least international law. I think, well, first, absolutely correct. 10 years ago, we weren't dealing with the level of threats, and therefore it wasn't really a conversation about talking about responses, right, and how to react to this. But since then, luckily, a lot of people have given a lot of their time internationally to think about the rules that we had and have today. Can we actually use them effectively to actually respond in a pretty effective and meaningful way? And yes, sometimes economic, you try to use the, if you will, less escalatory means to resolve this dispute, right, whatever it is. And the law actually requires that. But at times you will need to actually go to the higher level of the spectrum and maybe use force. So most of what the written statement for the record that I've given you, but also I tried to summarize it really quickly, was that's why I put most emphasis on really looking at some key terminology that we've all accepted under international law, use of force and armed attack, and come to agreement on what those terms mean. Why is that important? Well, it's because then we will all know where the line is.
I understand that part of your testimony.
And I think you can use
The
force.
gentleman would like to comment as well.
Sure, thank you, Mr. Congressman. So we talked earlier about a deterrence deficit. People don't believe that the U.S. will take action in response to these cyber things. And so
there's no deterrent unless there's a capability of retaliating.
Well, we have the capability. It's people don't think we'll do it. And so one of the most important things we could do is think, how do we persuade the people like the Irans, the Chinas, the Russias, that we would retaliate for some kind of cyber action? And many of us are coming to the belief that we might have to do it once.
Give me an example of when you say we'll retaliate, what that would mean.
You have a range of options. You could, for example, with OPM, you could have erased data on some of the Chinese computer networks that held the OPM data. That wouldn't have taken it away. It's gone forever, but it would have sent a signal. You could leak financial data on the Chinese leadership. You could interfere with the power grid. There's a whole range of things we could do, but I think the fear is until we do something, and it might be sanctions, until we show some reaction, people won't take our threats seriously.
Mr. Butler, do you want to?
I think it's important to look at who we're trying to deter, right? So in China, for instance, if you go back and just look at August and the Shanghai Exchange, I mean, something that would hurt would be to impact, them economically. They're trying to be part of a global economic
Well,
system.
give me an example of what you think we would have. China, has these assets that they are now building that will hurt us. What would we do with our capabilities to retaliate against a Chinese, well, they already are apparently, breaking into our banking system, et cetera?
If we could impact them adversely in an economic way, I think that will have a significant impact on them. I mean, more and more, I see people like Jack Ma of Alibaba, Huawei, and ZTE driving into the global economic system, needing business outside of China, and they have influence in China. On the flip side of it, we have organizations, US-based multinationals that have relationships in China and actually have Chinese clients. We should be taking advantage of that to shape the environment to our advantage, as opposed to waiting for something and then reacting.
I think this is a very fruitful discussion, but only probably the first one that we should have on this issue. And let me note that, let me ask this. When the chairman mentioned a cyber attack that may have taken place with the Iranians against some of our naval vessels, could that have been in retaliation for perhaps an Israeli attack on their reactors?
I don't know in that particular case. In other cases, there probably has been some retaliation because of attacks attributed to Israel. So the Karg Island incident, where the Iranian oil...
We are going to have to make sure that we establish, and this hearing is the first step toward getting an honest discussion of this. So I thank the chairman for scheduling this hearing, because we're going to need to know how to verify that there's been an attack, verify who the attack is from. We're going to determine what type of protection that we can have that will nullify or at least protect us against these attacks, what type of systems we need. And then we need to discuss, if there are attacks like this, what type of retaliation, what are our options of retaliation? Right. And as we heard earlier, that even the wording as to what will justify a type of retaliation, just the wording of it, we haven't even determined that yet. So
that's a really important
And maybe, Doctor, we could respond to that in writing. We're going to go to Alan Lowenthal from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank the panelists. I mean, this is something that I'm just learning myself, and I find it fascinating, but I certainly don't consider myself an expert in any way. I'd like to return now, when we're dealing with cybersecurity, and rather than the focus on where the attacks come from, on our own infrastructure and how much we are doing to protect ourselves and our infrastructure. I believe that the President has issued an executive order pledging, I think it was 13636, to improve our infrastructure, critical infrastructure, in terms of cybersecurity. I'd like to know what significant security developments have resulted from that executive order. Has it been effective? How much of our own critical infrastructure is vulnerable? And what are we doing about our own infrastructure to understand the vulnerabilities that we face today? Anybody want to jump in? Again, it's for my edification and maybe common knowledge to everyone else, but it certainly isn't to me.
No, I think it's a great question. And with the executive order, and actually prior to the executive order, certainly our life safety systems sectors have been taking action. They've been incentivized through the government to take more action. So I look at, again, I'll start with financial services and our banks and related financial service activities. They have been practicing, in terms of incident response for some time. They've been doing a lot of information sharing. They've gone beyond information sharing into joint solutioning. They've helped to develop automated ways of information sharing to find new standards. They've taken that globally. When I look at what's going on in the energy world, we've got work to do. Our energy grid, is a challenge, and based on the regulatory nature of how FERC and NERC work to support different utilities and co-ops and consortiums. And so we need to find ways to actually not only create incentives, but work through standards and get the grid to a point where it's a lot more resilient than it is today as we build out new infrastructure.
Had we not looked at these issues over time? Is that really we did not understand the vulnerabilities to our private sector and allowed them to develop without even questioning some of these issues? Is that true in terms of our own, say, Department of Defense, which may have been more responsive to some of these issues earlier? I don't understand the difference between the private sector development and the public sector, defense development.
Right. In the Department of Defense, we have been working on, the whole issue of cyberspace and operating effectively in cyberspace for years. We have continued to try to ramp up and improve our defenses as we've worked through concepts for growing cyberspace as an operational domain in conflict and warfare. From the private sector perspective, there's been different levels of understanding and knowledge, primarily driven by business motives. And so the financial services, even before the 2012-2013 attacks, the distributed denial of service attacks, were moving in a very accelerated direction to make themselves more resilient on a global transaction platform. I would say oil and natural gas is getting there, but they're late to the game, and they are working hard to catch up. They have to work through different kinds of upstream and downstream activities to kind of ensure that people understand at all levels within an organization, to include their supply chain, what's at stake. Certainly Saudi Aramco woke them up to that. On the grid side, in California, we've seen the physical attacks up in Menlo Park and Metcalf substation. Those physical attacks, there's been lots of educational outreach in terms of ensuring utilities in California and elsewhere are moving in that direction. The challenge is rate structures. It costs to build security, and one of the issues that I'm constantly faced with on the private sector side is how do I generate a return on investment as I build into security. What the President has done and the administration has done is opening up a new dialogue that allows us to drive more into incentivizing the private sector through threat sharing, ability using CPACs, Critical Infrastructure Partnership Advisory Council authorities, to get limited liability protection, to collaborate with government and others that are headed in this game, and to drive us to a new level so all boats rise together from the country's standpoint. But it is taking time.
Got it.
We started talking about this in 1998. In fact, we started talking about this in 1996. So it's been a slow progress, but banks, telecommunications companies, and defense industrial companies are generally at the top of the league. They're the best. Electrical grid, it's a very mixed performance. Some companies do good, some don't. One thing to watch is the new industry. So everyone knows your car is slowly becoming a rolling computer. So the auto industries, the airplane industries, they are beginning to focus on cybersecurity, but it varies from sector to sector, and we haven't found a good way to change that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We go to Mr. Randy Weber.
Thank you. Mr. Butler, what is the price? How high of a price is water if you can't get it? What price would you pay?
I think it's incredible. It's needed for life.
Yeah, I mean, it's whatever it is.
Price on it.
Whatever. Is your mic on?
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I guess it is.
Yeah.
So I'm fascinated by the exchange with you and Mr. Lowenthal about the infrastructure, for example, and the thought occurs to me on energy, electricity. We got to have it.
Right.
We absolutely have to have it. So maybe a redundant system, one that's connected, both of them connected to the grid. And I know the price, you mentioned rates would be important. I get that.
But there's people who have to have dialysis, there's police departments have to run, or military, and it's a security and it's a life issue in a lot of ways. So maybe the answer to that is a redundant setup where you have two power plants side by side. I know cost is a factor. One that is controlled, you know, through the internet, if you will, and I've got pipelines all over the state of Texas, and they actually can control the entire pipeline across the country from their control room. So maybe that's the answer. You know, maybe you have a standalone unit that's not connected to the internet, so none of our enemies can shut it down, but yet it can snap online in just a matter of seconds or minutes, more appropriately. So interesting discussion. Dr. Lewis, you said that the advanced cyber capability, in your comments, there was 5 countries: U.S., U.K., Russia, China, and Israel. Define advanced cyber capability.
The usual way to look at it is they could cause physical destruction. They could cause the kind of disruption in services that you were talking about. They could turn off electrical plants.
Is it safe to say that they have, for lack of a better term, a military officer or probably a 12-year-old kid in a computer room, hack? I mean, that's what they do. That's their job.
The bad news is that the countries that don't like us, including Iran, Russia, and China, have probed our critical infrastructure, have looked for vulnerabilities, and are prepared to turn it off if necessary.
Okay. What is the percentage of their success? Mr. Butler, you mentioned earlier they're watching people monitor the grid. Would you say that of those people who are trying to attack us, are they 1% successful, 10% successful?
My guess would be, I don't know what Bob thinks, would be closer to 100%.
Well, that's encouraging. And you said Russia and China, you ought to be putting sanctions on it. Is a reverse hacking, are we able to reverse hack them? Now, somebody mentioned, you know, maybe it was Dr. Lotriante, is that how you say that? Said releasing the personal financial information of Chinese leaders. Are you advocating that we have a department in our military, if you will, that actually does that, hacks to get back at them, and then, is that what you're saying?
One of the problems in this whole thing is we've taken a kind of a passive approach. We've taken a technical approach. We've focused on making our defenses strong, which you could call it a Maginot Line approach. We have to find ways.
How'd that work for the French, by the way?
We don't want to be on the same path.
You think?
I think we need to find ways to be demonstrate to countries that we will not put up with this.
So, Dr. Lotriante, am I saying that right? You are. Okay. You said in 2005 was really the first appearance of, was it a cyber crime? Was that international legislation? I missed that. That got by me. Do you remember?
Was that the 2008, the armed conflicts that I was mentioning?
That's what it was.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I wanted to set it up to say we're starting to see the cyber tools and operations be used within armed conflicts, and they're continuing. But at first, for state level, it was 2008 in Georgia and Russia.
I'm surprised that it took that long, quite frankly. And then, Dr. Lewis, you said the Israelis did a good job on responding. What does that look like?
They have an advantage because they're a small country, and one of the things that they have is they use their military to identify talent. So they recruit kids out of high school.
That's that set of, like I was talking about in China, they've got a group of people that's their attack, that's their platoon or whatever you want to call it, that's their job.
The Israelis are under attack probably every week by Hezbollah, very low-level attacks, and probably by Iran, by the Syrian Electronic Army.
Well, we are too, right? I mean, not necessarily by those entities, but others.
But they're a lot smaller, and so they don't have what you'd call strategic depth, and so they get a lot of practice. People are a little more afraid of attacking us, but we need to make them more afraid. So.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
We go now to Mr. Ted Poe of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The cyber attack on Sony Pictures Entertainment by North Korea In your opinion, Dr. Lewis, is that an act of terrorism?
Yeah, so it is one of these things that falls in this gray area because they did disrupt Sony Pictures. They leaked damaging material. They put out emails. It was a coercive act, right? Now, whether you call that terrorism or not, I would call it coercion. The North Koreans probably intended it to terrify Sony. So they were doing this intentionally to punish Sony for that movie.
North Korea used to be on the state sponsor of terrorism list. They're off. Do you think we should reconsider that, Dr. Lewis? Just your opinion.
Sure. No, I don't, because it's what influences how countries think about this doesn't have to do with sanctions that are external to that or terrorism lists that are external to that. We need to think about things that directly apply to cybersecurity. And that's where the committee might want to do some work. Putting them back on the list or taking it off, it's not going to affect their behavior. We need to do things that are more direct.
Because their behavior's bad.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Let me ask the other two witnesses. Same question. Do you think it's an act of terrorism? And if you think it is, should they be put back on the list? Just your opinion to all three witnesses.
Yeah, I rarely disagree with Jim. I think we need to spend more time thinking about what the North Koreans are really trying to do here. They're building a cyber capability, and they did achieve their desired effect in really terrorizing a large, entertainment firm. Where is that going to go? And so I think I wouldn't rule it out in terms of putting them back on an established terrorist list, but I think we need to spend more time understanding where they're growing with their capabilities as well as intent.
If I took a very legalistic approach to it under international law, I would call that not an act of terrorism, but a violation of the norm of non-intervention under international law, which is basically coercive
Wait a minute.
interference. Yeah.
What did you just say?
So, not to get in the weeds, the norm of non-intervention under international law, which is
The norm of non-intervention under international law.
It's what Lewis described as coercive. It's by definition coercive interference when you're basically bullying or forcing a state to give up one of its fundamental rights under international law, and that typically is seen as political elections, but also it can be the freedom of speech. So this was illegal. In my view, under international law, it was a violation of the norm of non-intervention, but not terrorism.
And just following up on that, the Sony situation, any consequences for that attack? Were there any consequences on the North Koreans for doing what they did?
So as a policy matter,
Did somebody call them to the principal's office? Were they retaliated against? Did we hack into their system? I mean, was there any type of response to that act by Sony?
I think they were scared. So one of the things that's come up repeatedly in the questioning is our ability to attribute the source of an attack. And about 8 years ago, DOD started to work really hard, put a lot of money in to be able to figure out who's doing the hacking. And I think the North Koreans were shocked that we were able to tell so quickly that it was them, and that scared them. 5 years ago, they did another attack on U.S. facilities, not as bad. We never were quite sure. This time we knew it was them. We could take pictures of the guys doing it, right? So it's that improved attribution capability that scared them.
So to answer that question, was there response or retaliation? What was publicly at least available to know, it does not appear that the U.S. took a public move in response or retaliation. Now, I would hope or assume that our intelligence organizations have responded to that. And under international law, a countermeasure to a violation of a norm of non-intervention is appropriate and legal. So if we have legal authority to take a countermeasure, has to be non-forcible. I would think that would be in the bailiwick of the intelligence community to do that, and we might not see or talk about that publicly.
Okay. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Ted Yoho of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this very important meeting. And I would propose or recommend, not recommend, I would ask that we build on this hearing to define what constitutes a cyber attack, and when it is an act of war or an act of terror, and define systems that fall under that, whether it's our electrical system, military system, power systems, hospitals, and whether that is a certain amount of life lost, any life lost, or a major economic catastrophe. And Dr. Lewis, you were saying we've known about this since 1996. That's 20 years. 20 years, and we still don't have a definition or a policy. I think that's way too long. We've just dropped the ball on this, and who's watching the hen house? I mean, this is not acceptable. Number one charge of America's government, as we all know, is national security. This is a national security threat, and technology will continue to advance, become more complex in the future, and we're going to be more entwined with that. And to not have those kind of policies in place is a shortfall of administrations, not just this one, but of past ones. And this is something we need to get on right now. We should have been on it, and I'm sure there's a lot more going on behind the scenes than we hear about. I'm sure it's like Jack Nicholson in that movie. You can't tolerate the truth, or you don't want to know it. And I think to ask you, what constitutes an act of war or an act of terrorism? Do we have a definition of that?
So one, I agree with you in terms of the amount of time it's taken to get to the point we are where we're actually talking about specific definitions and norms, I think has been too long. And it does remind me when I was in the intelligence community of the years leading up to 9/11. And it was like a good 15, 20 years it took people to understand what would be an armed attack under the law by non-state actors like terrorists that would allow us to use force in response against them and somebody else's sovereign territory. And I think it took us too long. So here we are in a different context, different types of threats, of course, but with the same principles that need to be discussed and defined. So really the focus of my whole point and my written statement was that we do need to get agreement on some very important terms with respect to international law and the use of force and armed conflict. Specifically, what is a use of force for purposes of Article 2.4 of the UN Charter? What is an armed attack for purposes of Article 51 of the UN Charter, which allows a country to use forcible measures in response? And so I think that we've had some laws that have developed at the UN, for instance, with respect to non-state actors. After 9/11, the UN Security Council passed two very important resolutions which cleared up the law and said you can go and you can use force and retaliate against even non-state actors.
That was U.S. law?
Well, it is U.S. law.
Well, and that's what I want to, it's fine that the UN has that, but the U.S. needs to have our own definition, so we don't need to go to the UN. We're saying we need to put this out to the world that if you do this, this is our response. And Dr. Lewis, you were saying we need to have a credible response. Unfortunately, our government right now has lost a lot of credibility. We draw red lines and disappearing inks. We call for regime change and deny. I mean, we can go on. And again, it's not just this administration. It's what America stands for. We have got to be able to project credibility with a policy and be willing to back it up. And what I would like to see is what is the appropriate response the U.S. should state it will do. Is it to retaliate and to put other countries on notice in the beginning and say this is what we're going to do? Is it an eye for an eye response, as my colleague Dana Rohrbacher said, or is it, we're going to respond 2 or 3 or 4 times worse than whatever you did? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, you've touched on some key points, and Bob is being a little modest here, but DOD has actually done a good job of coming up with doctrine on offensive use, defensive use of cyber.
I would like to see that, and I'd like to build that, because if somebody comes into my house uninvited, it's not going to be a nice response, and that's what I feel they're doing here. They're invading our privacy, they're invading our sovereignty, and for us not to have a response stated and put people on notice, I think is just such a shortfall. Mr. Butler?
Yep. Just building on the conversation. I mean, we have levels of activity: exploitation, disruption, destruction. Certainly when we hit disruption and destruction, we have a problem, and that should signal to the national command authorities we need to take action. The challenge inside this space is making sure we have the indications and warning before it happens. For instance, if we think we need to have some signaling with regards to what is happening to our industrial control systems. So if malware drops into our industrial control systems, that should be a signal that we should be thinking about taking action to counter before something rises to another level and we actually get into aggression.
All right, let me ask you this. With North Korea attacking Sony, we've had people here saying it wasn't North Korea, it was China working through North Korea as a proxy. What do we do when another country, a nation state, works through a proxy, maybe Hezbollah or in the future some terrorist organization, but we know it was directed by a nation state?
One of the
And if we don't have time, if I could get a response to that, I would love to hear that.
Okay.
Do you want me to just?
Yeah, go ahead.
So non-state actors as proxies for states' actions, right? Well, yes, we have authority, and it is under international law, and the U.S. could accept it, to take action against the state who is, if you can attribute the actions of the non-state actors to the state, you can use force and take it to the state, hold them responsible.
One place we get hung up on, and this is where the committee could help, is we get hung up on what is a proportional response. So there's a lot of debate. What's a proportional response to Sony? And that's where having some guidelines or some principles. There's a second issue, though, which is the one you brought up, which is maybe sometimes we don't want to be proportional in our response, and that would be useful to have guidelines on as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the extra time.
Thank you. We will pursue that question. We go now to Mr. Brad Sherman of California.
We don't play offense. China hacks. We don't talk about what tariff to put on all Chinese products in order to compensate ourselves for that. Not even allowed to talk about that in polite society. It is much easier for bureaucracies to say we want money for defense. Offense, oh my God, it's not politically correct. The unique vulnerability of China, and to some extent Russia, is the incredible corruption. We have the capacity through cyber and other means to identify which princelings own which chateaus. Dr. Lewis, do we have the capacity to find, document, and leak to the press the ill-gotten foreign assets of Chinese leaders and their children?
I believe we do, particularly because many of those assets are located in the United States.
And if you're trying to embarrass a regime, there's, entries on a Merrill Lynch form are interesting, but pictures of chateaus, McMansions, et cetera, are more so. To what, Dr. L., to what extent do we play offense in the sense of not just gathering in for traditional statecraft, spying on governments and feeding it into our intel operation? To what extent do we play offense beyond that?
I certainly think we have the capability. I also think we have the authority, legal authority, particularly Cyber Command and its authority legislated by Congress gives it both defensive and offensive capability. Unfortunately, I think because of the nature of those
Could we, for example, steal Chinese proprietary company corporate information and just either hand it to an American company, which would raise huge questions, which company, or just publish it?
If the U.S. government determined that they wanted, as a matter of policy, to conduct economic espionage, they could do it.
And do we have the legal authority to then publish the results?
Yes.
Do we have the authority to give it to those companies that correctly choose which political party to donate to?
Yes.
You mean we could leak it to one company and not another?
Well, when we discuss the economic espionage part, I think that's a concern of agencies in the U.S. government. Would there be any liability in terms of choosing between companies that benefit? Well, you can solve that by actually having a framework for, similar to when you put out a bid for a contract. There are processes.
You mean we would announce that we had stolen secret technology to build printing presses and then have companies bid? That would be interesting.
I think so too, sir.
And you say we have all the legal authority to do that. If we had a president who wanted to go in, steal some corporate, now the problem we have here is what's asymmetrical is we got a lot more intellectual property than they do. So that's, I don't want to get in a tit-for-tat, steal intellectual property world. What I'd rather do is get them to stop. Mr. Butler, can you think of any other offensive cyber techniques that we could use that the Chinese or the Russians would find painful?
I think for the Chinese, and as I mentioned earlier, as they're trying to integrate into a global economic system, anything that we could do that would impact their growth potential, Huawei, ZTE, Baidu, Alibaba, I think would have an impact. I think, like you said, sir.
Yeah, but it is asymmetric. Alibaba might want access to the U.S. market. Google does want access to the Chinese market.
Right, right.
Easiest thing, of course, is just tariffs on their imported goods, but and the asymmetrical way is to go after the corruption, because I gather from this panel there are no legal obstacles to espionage designed to identify and prove ill-gotten gains held by Chinese leaders and their children, and leak that to the press in both China and the United States. Mr. Lewis, do you see any legal bar to that?
No, I was just going to say that it would apply equally to Russia. So
Yes, I think it would have less political impact in Russia, although that regime has got to be a little shaky. I mean, China is trying to explain to its people why, under their great leadership, they may have to suffer with less than 7% growth. Putin has to explain a world of $44 a barrel oil, which is a much more painful world. Doctor, do you have it?
I would just say I think you wanted to reconfirm about the legality of it. Not only would that be legal, but in the past, as far as the first half of that scenario, doing it to them and leaking it, we have history outside of this cyber context that the intelligence community has done things like that before. So both legal under international law and under domestic law.
Okay, and so we have in pre-cyber methodology obtained embarrassing information about the leaders and families of countries we're not entirely friendly with and leaked it to the press. Unless Mr. Butler has a comment, I yield back.
Well, I want to thank our witnesses. There's one more favor that the panel could do for this committee, if you would. Mr. Ted Yoho of Florida had two other questions that we would like to get your response in writing to, if we could. Mr. Yoho, do you want to
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman.
lay
I
out those
appreciate
two
it.
questions?
The first one is, what is your recommendation to help facilitate our government working with private industry, or vice versa, industry working with our government to prevent or alert each other about attacks? That's question number one. The second one, which is really a two-question, are there any laws prohibiting us in follow-through on these? You know, something prohibiting us, and I know we got to go through the UN to be nice and all that, but again, my concern is the sovereignty and the protection of the United States government, and that law ought to trump everything else. And then, is there any laws that are needed for us to do what we want to do as far as protecting this country and our citizens and, you know, the economy of this country? Those, if you could do that, because what we'd like to do, according to Chairman Royce, is formulate a cybersecurity policy for the United States of America, and we don't want to wait another 20 years. And if you would do that, it would be greatly appreciative. How long do you think it would take? Can we get that in a week, within a week?
I can give you the legal answers in a day.
Perfect. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yoho. I appreciate those ideas, and we stand adjourned. And again, thank you very much, panel.
Monarchy?